Hello, everyone. So let's talk about Nosferatu. So, just for some background, this is a remake of the 1922 German expressionist gothic horror film Nosferatu, itself an adaptation of Dracula, which I'm sure many of y'all have at least some passing knowledge of. And it basically is the same story as Dracula, with some changes here and there. It was directed by Robert Eggers, who is known for The Witch and The Lighthouse, which are also horror slash thriller movies that are quite artsy and take place hundreds of years ago. So, of course, Nosferatu is something that is very much in his wheelhouse. And it was released on Christmas Day 2024, which I think is significant because the movie also takes place around Christmas. And I think religion plays a big part in this movie, namely Christianity and pagan, heathen religion as well. And we will talk about that. I wanted to talk about Nosferatu's genre because we talked about how genre can be significant to the rhetoric of a text. Obviously, this is horror, right? And horror movies tend to appeal to our 5 basic fears, and these would be extinction or fear of death, mutilation, separation, loss of autonomy or loss of control over oneself, and ego death, also known as loss of one's identity. So, of course, extinction. Nosferatu is dead. He's undead, and the character himself might represent our fear of death, right? And he also poses an existential threat because he releases that plague onto the town, which would, of course, kill people. Mutilation. When he sucks your blood, that is pretty mutilating, isn't it? And then there's separation, which I think is the big one in this movie because the whole conflict comes from Ellen being separated from her husband Thomas. And that allows Nosferatu to move in on Ellen. And then there is loss of autonomy, which this movie is rife with because Nosferatu is pretty much the one pulling the strings, right? And also Ellen quite literally loses control of herself. She sleepwalks and she has seizures and what have you. And then there's loss of one's identity, which I think also features in this because Nosferatu himself, he goes from Count Orlok to Nosferatu, the vampire. And that is kind of tragic for him because he loses his identity and he becomes this inhuman monster. And this is kind of weird of me to say, but after watching it again, I kind of sort of feel bad for Nosferatu / Count Orlok. But put a pin in that because we'll talk about that later. Now, Nosferatu has some symbols in it that help to send its message. Such as Thomas's locket, I think that's a big one. And then there is the Christmas tree, which I will explain why that's significant as we go along. There are religious symbols like crosses, right? Even this path looks like a cross. And, of course, the heptagram, or the 7-pointed star, that is sort of Nosferatu's symbol. Animals like the rats that carry the plague, and also Ellen's cat. So I don't want to go into detail with these because I want to leave it up to y'all to decipher these symbols. If you're in the online class, there is the discussion board where you will be doing that. So we're going to move along, but I will probably reference these as I go through the slides. I wanted to talk about the characters also. I wanted to first talk about Ellen. She is pretty much the central figure of the movie. She is one of the two protagonists, and I would argue her role in this movie basically reveals what the message of this movie is. She's a 19th century woman, and of course that comes with expectations. She is supposed to be chaste. She is supposed to not have psychic powers, but unluckily for her, she does. And of course, that causes her father to be afraid of her, and others to be her husband to be baffled and disturbed. And I think that might be related to women throughout the centuries being, accused of being witches. But that never happens explicitly to Ellen, but still her psychic powers are a factor that isolates her. And because she is isolated, and she's also isolated because, or at least shamed, because it seems she had some sort of sexual experience before she married Thomas, and in her society that's a big no-no. And her father calls her a sinner. Sin, sin, he said, if you remember when she's talking to Professor von Franz. So yeah, she's isolated because she goes against what is expected of her as a woman. And that is what invites Nosferatu in, because she asks for a spirit of comfort, and Nosferatu is the one who comes upon her. So it could be argued that the misogyny of the time is what led to all of this horror, and it could be a condemnation of how women were treated back then. I also wanted to note that she does love Thomas. I think there's no doubt about that. But, Thomas is her husband, and back then marriage wasn't so much about love as it was about stability, money, and what have you. And a part of her, I think, might desire Orlok, because Orlok seems to represent the sort of quote-unquote transgressive sexuality she isn't able to have as a 19th century woman. She is the only one who can defeat Orlok. She is sort of a Christ figure, I would argue, and I don't think it's any mistake that the film takes place at Christmas time. She is sort of a Christ figure, even though she's psychic, which was seen as sort of occult or what have you back then, even though she's not chaste, which is seen as a sin. She's a Christ figure nonetheless. And Christmas trees, of course, are pagan, started with pagan traditions, and then they became Christian over time. So I think that very much fits with Ellen, who is something of, she is against cultural expectations of women, but still, she's the good person. She's the one who can defeat Nosferatu. But there is another wrench I would throw into that, because the way she defeats him is by sleeping with him, as if that's all a woman is good for, is being a sexual object. So that is really sad and tragic. But if she did desire Orlok, at least we have the saving grace that she got to experience. She was sexually liberated. She got to experience that transgressive, quote-unquote, sexuality that she was denied before she died. But she died nonetheless. Let's talk about Thomas. So, Thomas is a good guy, I think. I think he genuinely loves Ellen. Nonetheless, he also, is subject to the expectations of his time period. He is the husband. He's supposed to financially support Ellen. He's supposed to have children with her, and his friend Friedrich is all like, when you gonna have kids? You know, because that's what you did back then, without exception. And Thomas sort of tries to be what society wants him to be by going through with this real estate deal where he goes on this dangerous journey to meet Count Orlok, and that sort of seals his fate and his wife's fate. So he really should have taken his wife's warning not to go on that trip, but of course he's the man, and the man must do what the man must do to make money and be the husband and what have you, even though his wife was like, "Don't do it, Thomas, don't do it." But anyway, yeah, and even his friend, who is all like, you should have kids, and, you know, you're the husband, and all this stuff, he tells him not to toss aside the opportunity, or what have you. But of course, he shouldn't have gone, because when he goes, that sets Nosferatu's plan in motion. That's how he gets Ellen, because he tricks Thomas into signing some divorce papers, if you didn't catch that. And yeah, that's how he gets Ellen. So Thomas was trying to be the proper husband, and it ends up being his undoing and his wife's undoing. And I think that is also epitomized by, or emblemized by, the fact that he, I don't want to say gets, well, I'll say it, he gets violated by Count Orlok in a way that is vaguely sexual. I don't know if you thought that, but he gets his blood sucked by Count Orlok, just like he does to Ellen, right? So, and it does seem to be some sort of metaphor for sexuality in some way. And of course, back then, two men doing such things was frowned upon, needless to say. And it was also considered emasculating. It's like his manhood is taken away. So, in other words, he tried to be the man that society wanted him to be. He tried to be the husband, the provider, who is over his wife, but he ends up being emasculated according to his society. So yeah, that was, he tries to fit society's mold, and he ends up becoming a victim of Nosferatu. So I think what we can get at is that society at this time was bad, is what we're getting at here. Anyway, let's talk about Orlok / Nosferatu himself. So, he was a nobleman who becomes a vampire, and he was a sorcerer, and he entered a pact with the devil to become a vampire. If you weren't catching on to the lore, that's a simple explanation for what happened. Ellen also makes a pact with him unwittingly at the beginning of the movie. She wants someone to comfort her, but it is Nosferatu who answers. But Ellen only called out because she was lonely, because she was ostracized. And you know what? I think he too was lonely and ostracized. He lives alone in that castle. And he is a foreigner, and it's often said that vampire stories represent the fear of the other, of the person you do not understand, because they're different. Because they have different customs and different ways of doing things, etc., and what have you. And as such, because he's a foreigner, in Transylvania, as opposed to the other characters who were from he's from Transylvania as opposed to Germany, where the other characters are from. So yes, I definitely think he might represent the fear of the other. I think he is quite lonely. I feel maybe a little bit sorry for him. And that is what I would say about Orlok. So, all of that said, I wanted to talk about some general themes in the movie now that we've gone through the major characters. So, the movie is really questioning what it means to be modern, because as I was alluding to, the characters live in a society that is quite misogynistic. They live in a society that's rather xenophobic. If we sympathize with Orlok because he is sort of othered because of being a foreigner. So they live in this rather, I would even dare say, primitive world, even though they think they're living in a modern world. And I think that whole idea is really exemplified by these two characters, by Dr. Sievers, who is all about traditional, well, not traditional, but conventional medicine that was modern at the time, quote unquote. And Professor von Franz, who has a more robust view of the world, who talks against the gaseous light of science and is open to the occult, right? And he believes in the occult. He's an expert on it. And he doesn't judge Ellen because it seems like he can look past this whole idea of modernity, thinking of it as sort of a farce, right? Because he never judges Ellen and he sympathizes with her. So, yeah, this is a backward sort of world where they talk about how they live in a modern world, but is it really? And I mean, let's be real. This guy wants to drain some of Ellen's blood, and of course, he shouldn't be doing that because she's the victim of a vampire. That's not what you want to do. So, yeah, modernity is definitely relative, the film is saying. And the characters are contending with ancient evil that their modern world cannot account for, be that the monstrous Nosferatu, who is the product of an ancient being, namely the devil himself, right? And even though they are quite the Christian society, their focus seems not so much on combating the devil. It seems more about keeping women in line or what have you, and shaming them for being psychic. So yeah, even though the characters minus von Franz are so confident in this little world they live in that they call modern, they are ultimately at the whims of Nosferatu. So, speaking of which, the film has a lot to say about the concept of providence versus destiny. So, providence, of course, is quite the religious word. It basically means God overseeing human affairs or having his hand in human affairs. And the word providence comes up a lot in the movie. It is said that Herr Knock, Thomas's employer, who gives him over to Nosferatu, he says it was Providence that Thomas came. He says he ultimately implying that it was Providence that Thomas and Ellen should become entangled with Nosferatu. But, Ellen has a different word for it. She calls it destiny, even though her friend Anna, who is very much in line with 19th century expectations of women, the passive woman character, she says, "Oh, you must be talking about God." But Ellen is like, no, it's not what you call God, because their version of God is, this person who wants women to act a certain way, and who wants men to act a certain way, and who is looking out for the German people, and maybe who worship him with their crosses, which you could see a lot of on the beach, referencing in that little graveyard, I suppose, referencing just how Christian a society this is. And they might think God doesn't look after the foreigners like Nosferatu, etc., who live elsewhere. But Ellen is like, no, I'm not talking about God. I'm not talking about Providence. She uses another word. She calls it destiny. She sort of shouts that on the beach. Which is why I have this beach picture here. But yeah, she sees past conventional notions of God and Providence. She knows that her fate is intertwined with Nosferatu's. And she might not know it, but she at least feels it. She senses it. She says she feels like she is being manipulated like a doll. And of course, Orlok is the manipulator. He insists that Thomas call him my lord, almost as if he is God, right? And he controls everything Orlok / Nosferatu does, until Ellen sort of steps in and changes destiny. Alright? So in other words, destiny can be changed. There are some things the movie seems to say. So not all is hopeless, but that leads me to the ultimate message of this movie. Sure, Ellen saved the day, but she did it by, basically being bait as a woman for Nosferatu's lustful desire, which is really sort of messed up and tragic. It sort of seems to say that misogyny is monstrous, like Nosferatu. But even though Nosferatu may be defeated, misogyny may never be defeated, right? Not all evils can be defeated in this world, is what the movie seems to say, although there is a little bit of hope. Maybe you can change destiny a little bit. But in the end, social evils like misogyny, like xenophobia, are always going to persist, because it's just human nature. And the movie does ask, does evil come from within, or does it come from beyond? And I would say the answer seems to be that evil comes from within, ultimately, doesn't it? Evil comes from prejudice and hatred, things like misogyny, things like xenophobia. Those things that have sprung out of man's heart from basically the beginning of humankind's existence. So that's what I would say about Nosferatu. It's saying, we as humans are all kinds of messed up, and there's really no defeating that, even though we may try. And how does that relate to our world? How is this relevant? Well, I wanted to say that, for one thing, Nosferatu is big in popular culture. I don't know if you've seen SpongeBob, but he's all over SpongeBob. Or at least he is nowadays. He also made a cameo in SpongeBob back in the early days of the show. But I think there's a reason it's such a mainstay of pop culture. It's because it really resonates. It shows us just how messed up we humans are. And it really makes us question, are we really that advanced as a society? Because, we defeated COVID-19. We have, you're listening, watching this lecture on a magic, it seems, screen, computers, iPhones, smartphones, the internet, all of this stuff. We have all this stuff. We're so advanced, it would seem, but still we have things like misogyny even today. Because, women didn't get the right to vote, for example, until 100 years ago when the original Nosferatu came out, which is kind of crazy to think about. So yeah, we still have problems to this day. And I think even though we would seem to be so advanced, we defeated COVID-19, which is much worse than the plague Nosferatu brought. And we still are struggling, trying to get along. And I think that's what Nosferatu is ultimately trying to say. So thank you guys. I hope this gave you some ideas about what to write about for this movie, and I will see you next time. Thank you guys.
Please comment the answers to or email me the answers to the following questions. 1. What are the 5 universal human fears? Explain how one of them comes into play in the movie. 2. Even though he is the antagonist, how might Count Orlok/Nosferatu be a sympathetic character? 3. During what holiday is the film set? How is that significant to its message?